Nothing. Just grab that box of bottles and don't touch what's on the front seat. What did I just say?
You said don't touch what's on the front seat.
From 1972 to 1977, Sanford and Son ruled Friday nights with junkyard laughs and unforgettable characters. But behind those roaring studio audiences and Fred Sanford's famous fake heart attacks, the show carried a hidden world of conflict, censorship, and cultural friction. Much of what happened on set never made it to the public. Today, we uncover the untold, the weird, shocking, and bizarre facts producers preferred to keep buried. From forbidden language on live television to power struggles and racial tension behind the cameras, this is the real story behind America's favorite junkyard family. Prepare for the truth that hid beneath the laughter as we count down 20 secrets from the classic sitcom Sanford and Son, Fred Sanford's forbidden words. In an era when network television was cautious about racial language, Sanford and Son broke a shocking boundary. In one courtroom scene, Red Fox, as Fred Sanford exclaimed, "There's enough endiness in here to make a Tarzan movie," a line that stunned even NBC executives. For a primetime sitcom, this was unheard of. The network's censorship team nearly cut the scene, but Fox refused, insisting that his use of the word was an act of reclamation. He told producers, "I can say it. You can't." Behind the scenes, tensions rose between writers, producers, and the network. Some feared backlash from sponsors, while others argued the line reflected real black speech of the time. In later reruns, that line was softened or edited out, hiding the fact that it had ever aired. This moment defined Fox's insistence on authenticity and producers' quiet struggle to contain it. They wanted ratings, not revolution. But with one explosive line, Fred Sanford made television history, and the producers spent years pretending it never happened. White writers, black voices. What audiences didn't know was that most Sanford and Son episodes were written by white writers, and that caused serious friction. The dialogue often missed cultural nuance, and Red Fox was quick to call it out. He and his co-star Demon Wilson frequently rewrote lines on set, arguing that black people don't talk like that. Fox reportedly told producer Bud Yorkin that the scripts made Fred and Lamont sound like white men pretending to be black. Writers grew frustrated, but Fox refused to compromise. His years as a stand-up comedian on the Chitlin circuit had given him a strong sense of authentic black humor, the kind that came from lived experience, not imagination. Producers eventually hired more black consultants to help translate the scripts, though they never publicized that decision. NBC quietly encouraged the writers to adapt to the cast's input, but they never wanted the public to know how dependent they were on Fox's rewrites. The result? A show that sounded natural and hilarious while hiding a cultural tug-of-war behind every line. Borrowed junk, adapted from a British sitcom. Most fans never realized that Sanford and Son wasn't entirely original. The hit American sitcom was adapted from the British series Steptoe and Son, which aired from 1962 to 1974. Both shows followed a grumpy junk dealer and his ambitious son. NBC executives believed that the dynamic could work for American audiences if they replaced the British class commentary with racial and generational humor from a black perspective. The show's creators, Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin, downplayed this connection in interviews, preferring to sell Sanford and Son as fresh and groundbreaking. But the British roots ran deep. In fact, several early episodes were direct remakes of Steptoe and Son scripts, with only minor adjustments for language and setting. While the American adaptation became a cultural landmark, the producers seldom credited the original openly, likely fearing that fans would see the show as less authentic. It was a case of creative recycling that mirrored the show's own junkyard setting. One man's old story became another's gold mine. The pay dispute that shook the set. In 1973, fans were stunned when Red Fox suddenly disappeared from Sanford and Son. NBC claimed the actor was on medical leave, but the truth was much messier. Fox had walked off the set after a bitter pay dispute with producers. At the time, he was earning $19,000 per episode, far less than many white sitcom stars, and demanded not only a raise, but also partial ownership of the show. Producers balked, and Fox filed a lawsuit against them for breach of contract, asking for $10 million in damages. He refused to return to filming for months. The show continued without him, awkwardly explaining Fred Sanford's absence as a trip to St. Louis. When Fox finally returned, he had secured a new deal: $25,000 per episode and 25% of the show's profits. NBC tried to bury the story, presenting his absence as health-related, but the Hollywood press eventually exposed the truth. The producers' attempt to protect the network's image only made the revelation more scandalous once it came out. Red Fox's secret age trick. Viewers loved Fred Sanford's grumpy old man act, but few realized that Red Fox wasn't nearly as old as his character. When Sanford and Son began in 1972, Fox was only 49 years old, playing a man in his mid-60s. His gray hair, stooped posture, and raspy voice were pure performance. Fox insisted on the illusion because it made Fred's constant complaints, ailments, and heart attacks more believable. Makeup artists used gray dye and shading to age him up, and wardrobe designers filled his clothes with padding to make his belly and shoulders look older. The transformation was so convincing that many fans genuinely thought Fox was a senior citizen. The producers never corrected the misconception. It helped the show's brand. The old junk man with a young soul became a marketing asset. Only years later did interviews reveal that Fox was decades younger than his on-screen persona, a secret the production had no reason to share. The hidden genius behind the theme song. Before a single line was spoken, the funky rhythm of Sanford and Son's theme song told viewers they were in for something different. Titled "The Street Beater," it was composed by none other than the legendary Quincy Jones. Its jazzy bass lines, complex brass arrangements, and infectious groove became one of the most recognizable TV themes in history. But what many fans don't know is that the music's origin story was as unconventional as the show itself. Jones had been experimenting with urban jazz and funk fusion for years before NBC approached him. He drew inspiration from the raw pulse of Los Angeles' Watts neighborhood, where Sanford and Son was set. The piece was originally created for one of his albums and later adapted for television after Norman Lear heard it during a studio visit. Lear immediately recognized that it captured the street-smart energy of Fred Sanford's junkyard world. Producers, however, wanted a safer, more traditional sitcom melody. Jones refused. He insisted the song represent the heartbeat of the ghetto, a musical statement of pride and resilience. NBC reluctantly agreed, and The Street Beater became the soul of the show. Its fusion of humor and grit mirrored the storylines perfectly, comedy with the rhythm of survival. To keep the show's tone light, producers never emphasized how political Jones's work was. The song's title alone, The Street Beater, hinted at the daily grind and ingenuity of Black America, something that resonated far beyond television. Ironically, the very thing producers tried to downplay became one of the most enduring parts of the series' identity: the casting that nearly ended the show. When LaWanda Page auditioned for the role of Aunt Esther, producers were unimpressed. Known mostly as a raunchy stand-up comedian from Red Fox's circle, she lacked major television experience. Executives felt her delivery was too rough, her timing unpredictable, and her gospel-inspired insults too harsh for network comedy. They decided to replace her after the pilot. But Red Fox had other plans. Page and Fox were longtime friends from the Chitlin circuit, and he knew her comedic instincts were gold. When producers moved to fire her, Fox threatened to walk off the show, saying, "If she goes, I go." That single act of defiance forced NBC to back down. They reluctantly kept Page, though they downplayed the incident publicly to maintain an image of smooth production. Once the show aired, audiences fell in love with Aunt Esther's fiery personality. Her sharp one-liners, such as "Watch it, sucker," became instant catchphrases. She transformed what was intended as a minor character into a cultural icon. The chemistry between Fred and Esther fueled some of the show's funniest moments, balancing insults with affection. Behind the scenes, producers realized they had nearly destroyed one of the show's greatest assets. Yet they never admitted the casting conflict publicly, preferring to market the dynamic as naturally perfect. The reality was far more fragile. Without Fox's intervention, Aunt Esther might never have existed, and Sanford and Son might not have become the phenomenon it did. The irony of Fred's heart attacks. Fred Sanford's fake heart attacks were legendary. Each time Fred clutched his chest, shouting, "This is the big one! I'm coming to join you, Elizabeth!" Audiences howled with laughter. It became one of the most iconic gags in sitcom history. But the tragic irony is that the bit mirrored Red Fox's real health struggles, a dark truth producers quietly ignored. Fox had long suffered from hypertension and exhaustion caused by grueling shooting schedules and nightclub performances. His comedic portrayal of Fred's heart attacks drew on genuine fatigue and shortness of breath he often experienced on set. Yet, producers encouraged him to exaggerate the gag, pushing it as a marketing hook. Posters and magazine features highlighted Fred's dramatics as if it were harmless fun. Years later, life imitated art in the most devastating way. In 1991, while filming The Royal Family, another sitcom produced by Eddie Murphy, Red Fox collapsed from an actual heart attack during rehearsal. Crew members initially thought he was joking, echoing his famous catchphrase. By the time they realized it was real, it was too late. Fox died doing what he loved, performing, but the connection to Sanford and Son was haunting. Producers from the original show avoided public comment on the eerie coincidence. They knew the gag that made audiences laugh had been drawn from the actor's own health battles. What had begun as satire of mortality ended as an unspoken symbol of Fox's life, a performer who turned pain into comedy until it claimed him. The sanitized reality of Watts. Sanford and Son was set in Watts, Los Angeles, a neighborhood still scarred by the 1965 riots and decades of systemic neglect. The show's junkyard backdrop symbolized poverty, resilience, and survival. But the version of Watts presented on screen was notably cleaner, safer, and funnier than the real one. NBC and Tandem Productions deliberately avoided addressing the harsh realities of urban life to keep the series lighthearted and advertiser-friendly. Writers occasionally hinted at social issues, but deep commentary was forbidden. Storylines about racism, unemployment, or police harassment were quickly rewritten or softened. According to production insiders, NBC feared that tackling real community pain would ruin the comedy. Even the set design contributed to the illusion. While the junkyard looked cluttered, it was designed to feel warm and familiar, not desperate or bleak. Red Fox, who grew up in St. Louis and experienced real hardship, pushed for more authenticity. He wanted Fred Sanford to reflect the frustrations of older black men struggling against poverty. But producers resisted, preferring to sell Fred as a lovable crank instead of a man weighed down by inequality. This sanitization worked commercially. Sanford and Son became NBC's biggest hit of the decade. Yet, in doing so, it erased the very environment it claimed to represent. Beneath the laughter, the sanitized version of Watts hid a deeper story about America's discomfort with its own reality. The junkyard dreams that made no sense. Fred and Lamont Sanford were self-proclaimed entrepreneurs, always scheming to turn junk into fortune. They dreamed of striking it rich by selling old refrigerators, antique lamps, and scrap metal. Yet many of their get-rich-quick plots bordered on absurd. In one episode, Fred planned to sell fake gold, and in another, Lamont believed a pile of broken glass could be worth a small fortune. Behind the humor was an odd reality. Producers wanted Sanford and Son to reflect the American dream, but the business logic rarely made sense. NBC executives worried that too much realism, like actual poverty or business failure, would make audiences uncomfortable. So they encouraged exaggerated, cartoonish plots that kept viewers laughing rather than thinking about economic despair. Writers often admitted that the show's business operations defied logic. A real junkyard could never have supported two full-time workers with a house, truck, and steady income. But the producers weren't concerned with realism. They wanted hopeful struggle. Fred's endless optimism in worthless junk became an allegory for the working class itself, hustling on humor when opportunities ran dry. Critics later pointed out the contradiction. The show celebrated hard work while ridiculing the workers' dreams. But for audiences, the absurdity was part of the charm. Every broken appliance and failed scheme reminded viewers that laughter, not logic, was the Sanford family's real currency. The racial tension hidden in the laughter. Behind the humor of Sanford and Son was a bold confrontation with race that NBC never openly discussed. Fred Sanford's jokes about ethnicity, stereotypes, and prejudice shocked many 1970s viewers. He called the Puerto Rican neighbor Julio Chico, mocked white policemen, and traded racial barbs with his friends. but what seemed like comic relief often disguised real racial commentary. Red Fox used his platform to expose subtle racism in America's everyday life. His characters' jokes reflected frustration rather than hatred, and the audience, particularly black viewers, understood the nuance. However, NBC executives didn't. They worried the show would appear too racial and alienate advertisers. Some lines were cut or softened before broadcast, and producers downplayed the deeper social intent in interviews. Writers such as Alunga Adele later confirmed that Fox fought to keep racially charged humor authentic, saying, "If Fred couldn't talk about race, he couldn't talk about life." Yet those same conversations were omitted from promotional material. NBC wanted a ratings powerhouse, not a political statement. The result was a delicate balance. Each episode delivered laughter layered with uncomfortable truths. Beneath Fred's jokes about race was a mirror reflecting America's double standards. The producers knew the truth, that Sanford and Son was never just a sitcom. It was social satire wrapped in laughter, a truth they preferred to keep hidden. The audience that wasn't always there. Most viewers believed the laughter on Sanford and Son came from a live audience, and often it did. But early in production, NBC debated whether the show should be filmed before an audience at all. The executives worried that a primarily black cast might not receive the same kind of live studio energy as white sitcoms did. They considered using only a canned laugh track. Red Fox opposed the idea immediately. He insisted that live laughter gave the show its rhythm and authenticity. "You can't fake timing," he told producers. Eventually, NBC relented and allowed a live audience, but only under strict conditions. Ticket distribution was controlled, and audiences were sometimes replaced with studio staff to fill empty seats. When audience reactions fell flat or jokes were mistimed, producers dubbed in extra laughter. This gave the illusion that the show's humor was always an instant hit. Behind the scenes, it was common to reshoot scenes multiple times to capture better audience responses. In interviews, Demon Wilson recalled moments when the laughter didn't come at all, saying, "Sometimes people didn't know if they were supposed to laugh." Producers later edited around those silences. The result was a perfect sitcom rhythm that wasn't always real. The laughter audiences heard was part truth, part illusion, another piece of production magic that producers preferred to hide. The rift between Fred and Lamont. On screen, Fred and Lamont Sanford shared one of television's funniest father-son dynamics. But behind the scenes, Red Fox and Demon Wilson's relationship was anything but perfect. At first, the two actors bonded over shared comedic instincts. Yet, as Fox's fame skyrocketed, tensions grew. Fox often showed up late to rehearsals, leaving Wilson frustrated. In 1974, when Fox temporarily quit over contract disputes, NBC kept the show running, writing Fred Sanford out of several episodes. Wilson felt betrayed, not by the producers, but by his co-star's sudden departure. He later claimed he found out about Fox's walkout through studio gossip, not directly from Fox himself. Although they eventually reconciled enough to finish the series, the bond between them never fully healed. Wilson later described Fox as a genius but impossible to work with. Producers quietly managed their conflicts to preserve the illusion of unity. They staged photo ops, joint interviews, and press statements emphasizing the family chemistry of the cast. After the show ended, Wilson revealed more details in interviews, saying that his relationship with Fox ended when the cameras did. Producers likely suppressed this reality because the father-son warmth was central to the show's marketing. The truth was far less wholesome. Two brilliant comedians held together by professionalism, not affection. The spin-offs that sank without a trace. When Sanford and Son ended in 1977, NBC wasn't ready to let go of its hit. Producers quickly developed Sanford Arms, a spin-off centered around the Sanford family's boarding house. But there was one major problem. Red Fox wasn't part of it. Without Fred Sanford, the show lost its soul. Despite heavy promotion, Sanford Arms lasted only 4 episodes before NBC pulled the plug. Critics slammed it as dull and lifeless. The network quietly canceled the show and avoided mentioning it during press retrospectives. Producers didn't want fans to associate the failure with Sanford and Son's legacy. A few years later, Fox returned for a revival, simply titled Sanford in 1980. This time, NBC again tried to reignite the magic, pairing Fox with a new supporting cast. But the chemistry was gone. Audiences missed Lamont, Aunt Esther, and the warmth of the original. Ratings plummeted. and the show was canceled within months. Rather than admit defeat, NBC buried the spin-offs, rarely re-airing them or referencing them in official materials. When Sanford and Son entered syndication, these failed follow-ups were left behind, almost erased from history. For producers, the best way to protect the brand was to pretend the spin-offs never happened. White to the core, the critics' hidden accusation. While audiences adored Sanford and Son, not everyone saw it as a cultural triumph. Prominent African-American critic Eugenia Collier famously described the show as white to the core, arguing that it portrayed black characters through the lens of white perception. It was a harsh critique that producers avoided addressing publicly. Collier and others claimed that the show reinforced stereotypes of black poverty and ignorance for white audiences' amusement. Although Sanford and Son broke barriers by featuring a predominantly black cast, its writers' room was still overwhelmingly white. Even when Red Fox pushed for more cultural truth, his input was often filtered through white producers who decided what made it to air. In private, Norman Lear acknowledged that balancing authenticity and network approval was nearly impossible. NBC executives wanted to keep the humor accessible to white middle-class audiences who dominated viewership. As a result, much of the show's racial satire was softened or edited to avoid discomfort. The irony was painful. A sitcom that celebrated black identity was also constrained by white gatekeepers. The producers, aware of the criticism, chose silence. Publicly, they spoke of universal humor and family themes. Privately, they knew Collier's critique wasn't entirely wrong. Behind the laughter was a cultural compromise that shaped television for decades to come. Hi, Fred Sanford's real-life inspiration. Few fans realized that Fred G. Sanford wasn't entirely fictional. The name came straight from Red Fox's real life. His birth name was John Elroy Sanford, and his father was named Fred Sanford, the same name he later gave his famous TV character. Fox's brother was also named Fred, and both men had been central figures in his childhood in St. Louis. When the show's writers suggested different names for his junk dealer character, Fox insisted on using Fred Sanford as a tribute. Behind the scenes, producers had mixed feelings about this choice. Some worried that blurring the line between the actor's life and the character might complicate Fox's public image. Yet, he remained adamant, even incorporating real family references into dialogue. When Fred reminisced about his late wife Elizabeth, Fox often drew from real emotions linked to his own personal losses. This blend of truth and fiction added emotional authenticity that audiences felt but didn't fully understand. NBC never emphasized the connection because it humanized the show in a way that conflicted with its comedic branding. They wanted a sitcom, not a semi-autobiographical drama. But to Fox, Fred Sanford was more than a character. He was a reflection of every tough, funny, and stubborn black father he'd ever known. Through him, Fox turned personal memory into cultural legacy. The junkyard props that weren't all legal. The Sanford junkyard was more than a set. It was a world of organized chaos, filled with rusted cars, scrap metal, and vintage furniture. But according to some crew members, not every prop used on Sanford and Son came from legitimate sources. Set decorators often sourced real junk from around Los Angeles, sometimes borrowing items without proper authorization from local scrapyards. Tandem Productions operated on a tight budget, and authentic set dressing was costly. The art department occasionally used trucks to gather discarded items directly from abandoned lots or donation bins, a practice that saved money but blurred legal lines. NBC officials later admitted that creative sourcing was part of keeping the show visually real. The realism paid off. Fans praised the junkyard as one of television's most believable sets. It even smelled authentic, a mixture of metal, oil, and dust that made visitors think they'd stepped into an actual salvage yard. Few realized that some of the junk wasn't returned after filming, leading to quiet complaints from scrapyard owners. Producers never acknowledged this publicly, choosing instead to highlight the show's commitment to realism. In truth, that realism came from street scavenging more than studio design. Fred Sanford's business might have been fictional, but the junkyard around him was often as real as it got. The hidden financial collapse of Red Fox. While Fred Sanford was portrayed as a cash-strapped hustler, Red Fox's real-life finances weren't much better, though for very different reasons. At the height of Sanford and Son, Fox was earning more than $100,000 per week in today's dollars. Yet, by the late 1980s, he was bankrupt. the IRS seized his home, his cars, and nearly all his possessions for unpaid taxes totaling over $3 million. Producers during the show's run had been aware of Fox's spending habits, but said nothing publicly. He lived lavishly, buying multiple houses, expensive cars, and throwing extravagant parties. NBC avoided discussing his personal finances, worried that the image of a broke junk dealer played by a wealthy star might undermine the show's relatability. When the truth emerged in the press years later, fans were shocked. The man who joked endlessly about poverty had lost everything. Fox later blamed poor financial advice and heavy taxation, saying, "The IRS was my co-star." His financial ruin also highlighted a broader industry problem. Black entertainers often lacked access to fair financial management or ownership rights. The producers who had built fortunes from his talent stayed silent, distancing themselves from his troubles. Red Fox's tragic decline mirrored Fred Sanford's struggles in a cruel twist of fate. The line between fiction and reality blurred again, except this time, the producers couldn't edit it out. The death slot that turned to gold. When NBC first aired Sanford and Son in January 1972, executives didn't expect much. The show was assigned the dreaded Friday 8 p.m. slot, known in television circles as the death slot. That time was notorious for killing new programs because families were often away from their televisions. But Red Fox's charisma flipped that narrative completely. Within weeks, Sanford and Son broke into the Nielsen Top 10. By its second season, it ranked second only to All in the Family, another Norman Lear production. The surprise success forced NBC to rethink its scheduling strategy. They had assumed audiences wanted clean-cut suburban sitcoms on Fridays, not an edgy, working-class black comedy set in Watts. Producers later admitted they had no idea the show would attract such a wide audience, especially white middle-class viewers. Fox's timing, the sharp writing, and the raw honesty of the characters struck a universal chord. Behind the scenes, NBC scrambled to take credit, but internal memos from the time revealed that the network had almost canceled the show before it premiered. After the success, NBC moved other high-profile shows into the Friday slot, hoping to replicate the magic. None succeeded. The junkyard comedy had turned what was once a graveyard for ratings into television gold. The repackaged legacy that hid the truth. After Sanford and Son ended, its syndication empire began. Reruns played on local stations across America for decades, introducing new generations to Fred and Lamont Sanford. But by the time these episodes resurfaced, much of the show's original edge had been softened or removed. Censored lines, racial jokes, and controversial episodes were edited out for daytime television, sanitizing the show's legacy. Producers and distributors wanted to preserve the show's profitability, not its truth. NBC edited out politically charged dialogue, removed mentions of race, and even trimmed scenes referencing alcohol or religion. The result was a nostalgic, family-friendly version of Sanford and Son, one that erased its social critique and cultural daring. Meanwhile, documentaries and interviews about the series often ignored the behind-the-scenes conflicts, pay disputes, and racial debates that defined its production. Norman Lear, though proud of the show's success, acknowledged later that some truths were too heavy for the time. Today, what survives in syndication is a selective memory, a version designed to make people laugh without reminding them of the risks that built it. The junkyard comedy became polished history, its rough edges smoothed away by decades of commercial repackaging. What producers once hid remains buried under the laughter, waiting for viewers willing to dig beneath the nostalgia to find the real Sanford and Son. From its junkyard setting to its timeless laughter, Sanford and Son was more than a sitcom. It was a mirror of America's contradictions. Beneath the jokes lived stories of struggle, race, pride, and persistence that producers tried to bury under the sound of applause. Red Fox turned pain into humor, exposing truths that television wasn't ready to face. Decades later, those truths still echo, reminding us that comedy can carry the weight of history. In every laugh and every line, Sanford and Son proved that even discarded voices can define a generation if someone dares to listen.